Just before we start, out of curiosity, I'm sure you've heard, perhaps you've known personally, but you surely have heard about James Hillman. What do you think? What do you think of him? I've sort of immersed myself in his lectures lately. I picked the name up from Rick, but have you? Did you? Were you?
Yes, yes. I read some of his. I mean, the Jungian.
Yeah, the Jungian. Yes.
Leading Jungian theorist. Well, I read some of his books and found them very helpful in explaining the basic principles of more clearly than Jung himself.
Precisely, yes. That's the. I'm fascinated by that, actually, by the clarity of.
Yes. So I mean, it was years ago that I read them, so I can't remember the details, but I know that I found them very helpful because they were, I think the clearest exposition I'd come across.
Yeah, and that seems to me as well. The clarity is just, and the wit and eloquence also is like
yes,
very, very fascinating. All right, so let's commence then. It's 10 past half now. Well, as you know, the key theme for this issue is memory, and I'd also like to give it bit of Indian touch, because we have in the music section, we have a story on Indian ragas. And I still don't have the visual image for the front cover. So perhaps we could like to ask you to ruminate perhaps on the theme of memory in the West and in the East, particularly in India, and how it. And the sort of practical purpose behind that question is that we still have to find the front cover that would sum up the Indian and memory and India. So that's the instrumental objective behind this somewhat vague question.
Well, I mean, the point is that memory is a relationship in time, and the front cover of a magazine requires something essentially spatial. So there is a slight problem, because I would say one of the big problems in thinking about memory has been that in the West, it's conceived of spatially, whereas in the East, it's much more temporal. It's about, and to put it a different way, in the West, there's been the assumption for most philosophers and for so-called common sense, that memory requires contiguity in time and space. In other words, a continuous causal link. So if there's a memory of something, there has to be a memory storage, and there has to be a causal link between laying down the memory, whether it's written on a page of a book or carved in stone or on a magnetic tape or in bits on a hard drive, that it has to be laid down, then it stays in a physical form, giving a direct continuity when it's laid down until it's retrieved. And so there's this idea has got built into Western thinking that, that it has to be preserved as a physical trace. And this goes back a long way. The ancient Greeks used the metaphor of seals in wax. And of course, memory, writing is a form of memory in a spatial material form. And writing was invented, 5,000 years ago. And then also the carving inscriptions in stone, which was a big deal in Sumeria and Egypt and so on, gave the idea of a permanent record. And so I think that all this helped to reinforce this idea of memory as being physical, based on physical traces. Whereas in Buddhist and Hindu thought, there's always been the idea that memory doesn't require a direct physical continuity, that it can jump across time and space. And the reason for that, I think, is that they start with the assumption that people undergo reincarnation or rebirth, the theory is slightly different in Hinduism and Buddhism, but both of them have the idea that there's a transfer of traces or memories or habits from one life to another life. And the person who may inherit those memories, the reincarnation or the reborn person, doesn't necessarily have to be descended from the person whose memories they inherit. They can be in a completely different family. And if you look at the history of the Dalai Lamas, for example, it's probably the best known case. They're not descended from previous Dalai Lamas because, after all, they're monks and don't have children. They pop up in a village, usually somewhere in Tibet, in an unrelated family. And therefore, for those memories to be transferred, and this is obviously a popular belief all over the Indian subcontinent and in Tibet, the idea of, memory of reincarnation or rebirth, and in Buddhist countries, then there has to be a leaping of the memories across space and time. Mm. And so sophisticated philosophers of memory, for example, D.T. Suzuki, the Japanese Zen scholar, in his book on the commentaries on the Lankavatara Sutra, he deals with the idea of memory as not being connected in space and time. It can leap. And the Theosophists took up this Eastern idea of memory, but then they translated it into Western terms and talked about the Akashic records, reintroducing the idea of some kind of celestial filing cabinet, or where there's some actual memory store in the sky or in space or something, which isn't really part of the original Eastern conception. That's when this idea got translated into Western terms by Western Theosophists in the late 19th century. So anyway, given this difference between East and West, it's not immediately obvious how you'd represent this. I suppose you could have a diagrammatic representation where on the Western thing you have the cause, and then you have a continuous link, and then the effect, or the laying down and the recalling of the memory. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the Eastern thing, you could have it laid down and then recalled here, but without anything in between. Mm-hmm. But even that's misleading because it's a spatial metaphor of a gap in time. And my own view is that the past is potentially present everywhere. So the idea that there's an actual gap in time is imposing a spatial metaphor. It'd be better to see them as together in a sense.
Yeah, it seems to me that the Western thinking is so much in this clockwork paradigm that there has to be one clock affecting the other, or is that the whole? I mean, you've emphasized this influence exerted by the clockwork mechanism on the Western thinking during the scientific revolution.
It's not just clockwork, because as I say, the ancient Greeks had the idea of seals in wax. Right. And the metaphors have changed over the years. In the early 20th century, the idea for memory was like a telephone exchange where you have a wire going out, a wire coming in, and you put a jack plug in to join up these a memory arc in the brain. And it was like an old-fashioned telephone exchange where you join the wires together. And this became later, in a more sophisticated form, the synaptic modification theory, that the nerve endings are modified to connect nerve cells up to form memories. So clockwork isn't mechanistic, or at least material continuity is the key thing in these Western.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, material continuity.
But I mean, one has to say that although that's the majority view in the West, it's not everyone's view. And in the ancient world, Plotinus, the great Neoplatonic philosopher, thought of memory as an aspect of the soul rather than the body, and therefore as not being material. And in the 19th century, Henri Bergson, in his great book, Matter and Memory, it's the 125th anniversary this year of the publication of the French version, Matière et mémoire, by Bergson. He put forward the idea that memories are not stored in the brain, that there's a direct continuity over time. And this was also explored by the philosopher Bertrand Russell in his idea of mnemic causation, M-N-E-M-I-C, mnemic, memory causation, as a possible form of causation directly connecting across time. And then Ludwig Wittgenstein also explored a similar view of memory as not involving physical traces. So it's certainly been discussed by some Western philosophers. And my own interest in the subject was largely triggered by reading Bergson, who I think is a wonderfully original and even today refreshing philosopher to read.
Right. The one obvious solution to this practical problem of cover, of front cover, was just I googled for the Indian goddess of memory, but it didn't kind of yield you sort of clear answer. Does that kind of?
No, well, the Greeks had a goddess of memory,
Yeah.
Mnemosyne.
Yeah, exactly, yes. But India still doesn't seem to have that. Ganesha kind of came up with in this context, but please.
Yes, well, it's not obvious at all how you could have an image of memory that gets away from the idea of memory traces. Well, I mean, in a sense, animal instincts are memories. And, you know, every animal instinct is a kind of memory of the behavior of previous animals. I mean, at least that's my view. I suppose the conventional view would be that that memory is inherited through the genes. So again, the conventional view in biology would be to attribute instincts to material traces in the form of naturally selected genes.
Right.
I mean, I don't think that can possibly explain it, but that's a more complicated idea than you can represent on the cover of a book. When I had to think about this for the representation of in my own books on A New Science of Life and the Presence of the Past, and for A New Science of Life, I had this idea, you know, because morphogenesis, this unfolding fern, is a kind of memory. Again, that's according to my own views, but again, it wouldn't be necessarily obvious to everybody reading, just looking at the cover. But for me, there's a morphogenetic process represents a kind of memory. This fern is remembering what countless ferns of its species have done before and doing the same thing again. And then for my book, The Presence of the Past.
I have that one.
Yes. Well, you see, the reason that I have this butterfly on the cover is, again, representing the fact that it's a kind of memory, the way it's created, the way it appears. So again, it's trying to represent that morphogenesis, the development of form, involves a kind of memory, and that it's a kind of memory in the case of a species of insect that's gone on for millions and millions of years. But again, that wouldn't necessarily be obvious to people picking up your newspaper supplement on a newspaper stall.
Oh, that's good enough as far as the introduction goes. I mean, we've delineated, I think, the key issues there, and I also very much like that you brought up you brought out your book from 1982. Is that correct?
Yes, well,
the new time for life is not 1892 or 91?
1981.
81.
But this what I just showed is the second edition, so that's the new edition. The original edition didn't have a cover. I didn't have a picture on the cover because we couldn't think of a suitable picture.
Okay, so you had the same problem.
It had a typographical cover, yes. Yes.
All right. Well, anyway, we have again the whole issue is devoted on the memory, and we have four permanent sections. Well, four permanent faculties, so to speak: physics, music, psychology, and mythology. And in the physics section, we have a story about water memory and about Jacques Benveniste affair, which happened, I think, 6 years after your what's the word? After your conflict with the John Maddox, I think that would be the
yes.
Maddox was heavily involved in both. Was his editorial also in 81 then?
He was the editor in 1981. Yes.
Yeah, and 7 years later, I think was, if I remember correctly, Benveniste affair was 88. How familiar are you with the Benveniste affair? And I know you've participated in these water conferences that the author of this article also mentioned. So please, just marked out the theme. Could you just elaborate on that?
Well, Benveniste, I met Benveniste in Paris after this affair. We were at some kind of alternative science conference. And the thing about Benveniste that was so surprising to me really was that he was so non-alternative. He was actually really quite conventional and rather arrogant. And he was he was a Marxist, he was a materialist. He wasn't somebody who'd come into science with some spiritual views or anything. He got interested in this subject, he'd done the experiments, he'd come up with a surprising result, he'd published it. And then he found himself subject to a phenomenal amount of attack and a kind of witch hunt. And he was completely baffled by it at first because he wasn't used to that. I mean, he was used to being a respected member of the French scientific establishment with conventional materialist views. And suddenly he found himself in the middle of this storm, and he really didn't know what had happened. I mean, he was very disoriented by it. And it changed his life. I mean, it obviously completely deflected him from his previous scientific course. He was very upset by it. And then, as no doubt your article shows, that a lot of this research was taken up by Luc Montagnier, who, because of his Nobel Prize, was in a more, respectable position. But of course, a Nobel Prize doesn't protect you when you're being attacked by this kind of scientific vigilantes. I mean, Montagnier has been attacked as well. And I mean, Brian Josephson, who got the Nobel Prize for—
his name came up as well.
When he got interested in consciousness and quantum physics and took an interest in parapsychological phenomena, he was attacked and marginalized, even though he's a professor in the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, has a Nobel Prize. So I always used to think a Nobel Prize would confer some level of immunity from these attacks, but it doesn't. And so, I mean, I've looked at Benveniste's results and they seem to me, he was reporting an effect that he'd observed, and I just have no particular theory one way or the other. So I mean, I wouldn't have predicted this effect on the basis of morphic resonance. On the other hand, I wouldn't have predicted it doesn't exist. So I have a fairly neutral position on water memory. And for me, it's just a question of the evidence. And I've been to talks by Luc Montagnier, where he claims to get information from DNA and other molecules in water, and even more remarkably, to transmit it over the internet through electronic means. That I find very, very hard to understand or indeed believe. And you get into an area there where I just don't know what to think about it. I mean, I'm not against it, I'm not for it, in the sense I'm just completely neutral. For me, it's only a question of, do the data show this? And it would be really helpful if other people had replicated the data more than they have, to know whether this is for real or not. I just don't know.
Basically, the upshot is that the Benveniste was firmly within a materialist framework and was attacked nevertheless.
Yes, he wasn't somebody who had a track record in kind of New Age spirituality or anything like that. In fact, he was rather anti-spiritual, I would say. A typical French atheist type intellectual. I mean, I'm not sure whether he developed spiritual interest later in life or not, but when I met him, he came across as being a typical French materialist intellectual who'd got somehow rather unexpectedly found himself in deep water.
Yes, that's Maddox then. That's the I've been, if I were like a fiction writer, I'd quite like to write a monoplay, Maddox's Night, where he would plan out his editorial in 81. So that kind of thought came. What kind of, if you were to write such a play, kind of monoplay, how would you think Maddox reasoned? I mean, that was a heavy and disproportionate attack on your book that a lot of our readers don't know about much. And what motivated his pen and thought?
Well, Sir John Maddox, who was the editor of Nature, was also a militant atheist, a very committed materialist, an activist. He was in the Rationalist Press Association. You know, he was an active member of militant atheist organizations, and also a fellow of the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, CSICOP, which is a militant skeptic organization that aim is to debunk anything that goes against the materialist worldview. So he was one of these people who's passionately against anything to do with telepathy, psychic phenomena, anything that didn't fit into a rather reductionist materialist worldview. He'd built his whole life on that belief system. So when my book came along, claiming there was a kind of memory in nature, that memory is not stored in the brain, that the genetic approach to inheritance can only explain a small part of the picture, not all of it, that molecular biology is very limited in its explanatory capacity. All these things were tremendously offensive to Maddox. He found that it was an attack on the very foundations of what he believed. So he was very angry and upset by my book. And he was upset and angry because I was a card-carrying member of the science establishment. You know, I'd sort of been a fellow of a Cambridge college. I'd been a research fellow of the Royal Society. I'd met Maddox when I was at Cambridge, and I'd published papers in Nature. And so I was very much part of that British scientific establishment world. So I think he saw me as a kind of traitor. And in a later attack on my work, I think it was on my book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World, I forget which book, which he reviewed in Nature or in one of our British newspapers. He compared me to a lapsed Jesuit attacking the Church of Rome. And you see, he kept coming out with these ecclesiastical metaphors,
exactly,
which placed himself as in the position of the Pope. You know, when in 1994 he was interviewed for a BBC television program about me, he said that I deserved to be condemned as a heretic in the same language and for the same reason that the Pope condemned Galileo. Well, not a very fortunate parallel for him to choose.
I remember that well. We have a clip with that passage.
Yes, well, you see, for me, the interesting thing is he's, I mean, obviously it's quite nice to be compared to Galileo for me, but what he was doing was comparing himself with the Pope. And so he saw himself as editor of the leading international scientific journal as needing to exercise an authority to establish scientific orthodoxy. And if he couldn't do it, who would? So I think he felt that the burden of maintaining orthodoxy fell upon him. And because he was such a militant and outspoken person about, you know, his materialist beliefs and his militant atheism, I think I somehow made him very angry. And I know later, because years after he died, years later, I was talking to his daughter, who's a journalist in Britain now, and she said that when she was a child, she often witnessed these arguments going on at the breakfast table between her parents, whereas Maddox's wife tended to support me and you know, sometimes took my side. And he was sort of obsessed with me and my continuing production of books that defied the scientific orthodoxy. And I mean, I think he thought with his 1981 attack in Nature that basically he'd excommunicated me from the scientific world. He was trying to do. He was trying to excommunicate me and make sure I'd never get a job in science again and never get a grant. And he succeeded. I mean, it meant I could never get a job in the university. And not that I tried, I didn't particularly want one, but so it didn't worry me that much. But what did make a difference and was definitely harmful was that it meant it was I became dangerous to know. So it was difficult to do research in labs because people felt if they worked with me and gave me lab space that they'd be attacked themselves for, you know, sheltering a heretic or encouraging a heretic. And so it meant that I was dangerous to know. And for years afterwards, even until quite recently, if I was invited to give a talk at a university, the person who invited me would often get attacked by members of the university for inviting me. And of course, this Maddox attack still resonates and is the basis of the very negative image that the Wikipedia editors give to me in my Wikipedia biography. It's the whole aim of it is to portray me as a pseudoscientist, and when other editors have challenged that, they always come back to this Maddox attack as the basis for their authority in dismissing my work. So it's not as if it only happened 40 years ago, it's still happening today.
Have things changed in Nature, though, from Maddox's time?
Oh, yes. I mean, obviously the scientific journals have to move with the times, and you know, the Maddox's confidence that molecular biology would explain everything to do with life turned out simply not to be true. And the discovery after the Human Genome Project, the discovery of the missing heritability problem, which became a major issue in biology, it turned out that genes only explain 5 or 10% of the inheritance of most characteristics, or even less, including height and proneness to breast cancer and so on. The most inheritance doesn't seem to be explained by genes. They play a part, but a relatively small part. And that's because what genes do is code for proteins. And if you have a protein that gives a characteristic in a one-to-one relationship, the genes give a very good explanation, like in cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia, where there's a single gene gives a single defective protein that gives a particular disease. But for most features, the shape of someone's face, their proneness to get a particular disease, their ability to learn languages, to learn music, or their sense of smell, most things like that depend on many different genes, and also on non-genetic inheritance, which I think is due to morphic resonance, but which is currently comes under the heading of the missing heritability problem. Well, that kind of thing, of course, has been discussed in Nature, as indeed has the replication crisis in science. It turns out that many aspects of scientific research are not reproducible. Papers in leading journals can't be reproduced by other scientists. And this replication or reproducibility crisis, again, Nature has featured this. They have to feature these things. They're part of science. And the more recent editors of Nature have been more open-minded and less dogmatic than Maddox. Maddox, after all, had a personal crusade to promote atheism and materialism. And later editors don't seem to have had such a strong personal crusade. They've been more open to what's happening and reflecting the changing currents in science.
Well, given your gift to explain complex things, one question, good that the Human Genome Project came up. I mean, you've emphasized that this was kind of watershed, that the failure of this project shifted the attitudes around molecular biology. What really was the ambition of the what was the ambition of the Human Genome Project, and what are the consequences of its results? I think that seems to be an important issue in this respect.
Well, in the 1960s, after the triumph of discovering the structure of DNA and the genetic code in the 1950s and early 60s, leading molecular biologists like Francis Crick and Sidney Brenner thought that basically all the problems of life could be solved by molecular biology, by reducing life to the molecular level.
Material carriers, basically. Material carriers, basically.
Yes, to reduce everything about life and inheritance to these material genes and to the proteins that they gave rise to. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned the story in my book, The Science Delusion, as you know, when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, the third-year undergraduate in 1963, Crick and Brenner gave a series of private seminars. They invited about half a dozen students who they thought were the most promising to these private seminars once a week in Brenner's rooms in King's College, Cambridge, where they were basically telling us about the leading edge in molecular biology. And basically their aim was to recruit us to work with them in the Laboratory of Molecular Biology, which has been set up recently in Cambridge. And they made it clear that they thought that there were two outstanding problems in biology. One was consciousness, and the other one was development or morphogenesis. And they said, we're going to solve these problems within 10 or 20 years. Crick said, I'm taking consciousness, and Brenner said, I'm taking development. And they both wanted to lead a molecular assault on these problems and solve them within 10 or 20 years in molecular terms. Now, this led to a tremendous, they were very influential. The molecular biology lab in Cambridge became one of the world centers for molecular biology. And one of the things that grew out of that approach in the 1980s was the Human Genome Project, the idea that it was now technically feasible to sequence every single gene in the human genome. And the idea was that if you know all the genes, the sequence of bases in all the genes in the genome, that this is like the molecular book of life, and the whole of human nature will be laid bare in molecular terms. We can read the book of life, predict, they believed they'd be able to predict every aspect of somebody from their genome, and modify it at will by genetic engineering or gene editing, and create any abnormalities they wanted to, unusual development. So it was this sense of complete power over life through understanding the genome and manipulating it. It was, some people called it playing God. You know, this idea that it could be complete, humans could take control of their own evolution. This was one of the dreams of scientism, or secular humanism in its most extreme forms in the 20th century, that, you know, evolution, human evolution is now under human control. No need for God, for sort of superstitious beliefs, etc. Science and reason lead humanity on a path of progress, ever onwards and upwards. And this was part of that general agenda. And so the Human Genome Project, when it was completed in 2000, the year 2000, and the final, the draft was published in 2001, many people thought this was it. We'd understand everything about human nature. But it turned out that, first of all, instead of about 100,000 genes, there are only about 20,000. We have less than a rice plant or a sea urchin. And they're 99% the same as a chimpanzee. So it didn't give any very clear answer. And then secondly, when within the next few years, it became possible to sequence tens of thousands of genomes, they could then look at what are called genome-wide association studies to see which genes correlated with phenomena like height or proneness to breast cancer and so forth. And it turned out that the genes they could find explained only about 10% or less of heredity, the missing heritability problem, it came to be called. So it turned out the genes don't explain every aspect of inheritance, which I myself had been saying that since the 1980s. So when I said in the 1980s, I thought genes were grossly overrated, people thought I was joking. But actually I wasn't joking. And I was saying it because we know what genes do. They code for the sequence of amino acids in proteins, and some are involved in switching on or switching off other genes. But this making the right proteins doesn't explain the web spinning behavior of a young spider. It explains the proteins that are in the web, but it doesn't explain the shape of the web or the way the spider behaves. Making the right proteins is necessary for a baby cuckoo to grow up into a mature cuckoo, but it doesn't explain the way that young cuckoos migrate to southern Africa along with other young cuckoos every autumn from Europe to Africa. And making the right proteins is important for your skin and my skin, but it doesn't explain the shape of your face or my face. It explains the chemicals in our skin and in our bones and so forth, and in our eyes and the pigments of the color of our eyes and that kind of thing. Those depend on the right enzymes and proteins, but it doesn't explain the shape or the form. So genes as the way of explaining biological memory, the memory of form and the memory of instincts, have a limited role. They explain, and now epigenetic inheritance shows that some genes can be turned on or off in a hereditary way, a heritable way. It may not last more than a generation or two, may last longer. So there's a material basis to some aspects of inheritance, but which is a form of memory. But it only explains some aspects of it. And I think that the other aspects depend on morphic resonance.
Right. Just to establish the connection with the other articles in this issue, in the mythology section, we have a very interesting article which asks about, which asks the question, do places have memories? And this is kind of, I think, fits in nicely with the chapter on pilgrimages and holy places in your book, Spirit, Science and Spiritual Practices. But how would you I'd like to ask you to speculate on this idea of a memory of a place. Do you think places have a memory? And if they do, how would you, well, memory, the theme of the question is memory of a place.
All right, well, the thing is that my whole the basis of my thinking about memory is that it depends on the resonance across time, as we've already touched on. So if a place has a memory, I would expect it to be based on a memory across resonance across time, not etched in the stones of the place. You see, some people think places have memories, and because memory is material, they think the place must have somewhere in the stone or somewhere in the ground or something, there must be memory traces for the place to have a memory. Well, that's contrary to the whole spirit of understanding memory that I work with. So I don't think that the place has a memory in the sense that it's somehow etched into the stone or of a cathedral, for example, or a megalithic monument like Stonehenge. I think memory depends on resonance. So then how would a place have a memory? I think places do have memories. I've felt it myself when I go into certain holy places. I feel a strong atmosphere that seems to me built up over the years of worship and prayer and mystical experience and liturgical connection and sacred chanting and so on in those places, that it builds up an atmosphere. And also there are negative memories in some places. Typically stories of hauntings involve some story about something terrible that's happened in that place. So I think there is a kind of memory associated with places, but how does it work? Well, my own view would be that it probably works by when you enter that place, you're in the same set of sensory stimuli as other people who've been in the same place. It looks the same, it smells the same, the stained glass windows in the cathedral look the same, the general architecture and the sacred geometry are the same as people have experienced them, in some cases for many centuries. And so I think by morphic resonance, we tune in to the experience of previous people in that place. So I think it's a collective memory of experiencing that place that we tune into, positive or negative. If there are bad memories, then we pick up those bad memories. If there are good memories, good experiences in that place, we resonate with those. So I would say that there are memories in places, that places can feel quite different depending on what's happened there in the past. And that the probable explanation is in terms of resonating with the people who've been there in the past, or possibly animals and other living beings, but not that the memory is actually in the stones of the place or in the earth itself.
So basically the physical phenomenon which, to the extent that I understand it, the physical phenomenon that carries all this mechanism of memory transformation is vibration, then, without material carriers, or would that be the well, would you agree with that? Yeah, vibration.
That's it. Well, I mean, the word morphic resonance implies vibration because resonance happens between vibratory systems. So what I'm postulating is a resonance across time. We're familiar with resonance across space in sympathetic resonance of stretched strings. You know, if you push the sustaining pedal down on a piano and you chant ooh into the piano, it will go ooh back. And if you go ah, it will go ah back. And that's because each of these notes has different pattern of overtones. Our vowels, even when you chant them on the same note, have different patterns of overtones. And those, the whole pattern, resonant pattern, is reflected back, as it were, by the resonating strings of the piano. Now, radio and television and mobile telephones also work on resonance. I mean, that's why you tune a radio to a particular wavelength or frequency, so many hertz, namely cycles per second, hertz being a measurement of frequency. So all our radio technologies, in fact, almost all the most characteristic and up-to-date modern technologies are resonant technologies. So we're very familiar with that. I mean, right now, you and I are sitting in rooms full of electromagnetic radiations, which could become resonated with if we have a radio set or a TV set or a mobile phone that can tune into them. They're all there, invisibly present. And in a similar way, I'm suggesting there's a resonance not just across space, but across time as well. And that's how memory works, by morphic resonance. And so it's a direct resonance from the past to the present. And instead of thinking of the past 100 years ago as being 100 times further away than 1 year ago, what I'm suggesting is the whole of the past is potentially present everywhere. It's sort of concertinaed up into the potentially present, and if anything's similar, it will resonate with anything similar in the past.
On the basis of similarity, then?
On the basis of similarity. Right. So vibrations and similarity. And similarity not only in frequency, but in patterns of resonance, because it's not as if you and I have a single frequency. It's not as if I could say, well, Hardo is 127.3 hertz and I'm 122.1 hertz. It's not a single frequency. We're patterns of frequencies, and so are molecules.
Oh, it doesn't matter then.
Yes, all of matter is pattern. You know, an atom has a frequency of vibration in the nucleus. The nucleus is a vibrating structure, and the electronic orbitals around it have a frequency. And in a molecule, you've got all the different frequencies of the nuclei and the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, etc. And then you've got the resonant frequencies of the electronic orbitals, and then the outermost electrons whiz around the whole molecule, creating this kind of vibratory membrane around the whole structure. But there's all these different vibratory patterns involved. And in our own case, there's the vibrations of our brain waves, sort of gamma waves, say 30 hertz. There's our heartbeat, there's our breathing rate, there's our daily rhythms of sleeping, there's our annual rhythms of going through the seasons. There are many different rhythms superimposed on each other. And so we're not just a single frequency. So these vibratory patterns can't just be reduced to one frequency. They're complex spatio-temporal patterns of vibration, and that's what resonates on the basis of similarity.
Right, we've got like 15 minutes to go, even less a bit. One of the, well, I worked intensely with your last, is the ways to go by, the ways to go beyond is your last book, is it? Well,
yes.
I worked intensely with your last books and listened to your lectures, and one of the things that I've sort of picked up from these lectures and these two books that I've translated is that the importance of Reformation in all these our present understanding about nature and society. And how would you characterize the role of Reformation as it has both as it applies to your views on memory and the Western views on memory, and how it applies to basically to the present situation? So it's like a Reformation of the 16th century then.
Well, the Reformation was obviously a radical break with the past in Northern Europe, in those countries where it happened. And I think it had several effects. One of them was to disenchant the world. Before the Reformation, there was a belief that Christian Europe shared with the rest of the world, in non-Christian countries and pre-Christian cultures, that nature's alive. We live in the living world. The stars and the planets are living beings. The animals and plants are truly living beings. The earth is alive, Mother Earth. We live in a living world, and the God that they thought of was in nature, and also nature was in God, a view which is now called panentheism, everywhere and in. God was in nature and everything was in God. And so there was a divine presence in all nature, and human life was part of a larger divine order of a living cosmos, and that we played an important role in this, but not the only role, obviously. There was also a sense of continuity with the past that was important in pilgrimage, which was a very important part of medieval Europe, as it has been of all religious traditions, where places had a particular power and ability to affect people. We've discussed already the memory associated with places, but of course some places have a natural power, a mountaintop, for example, a waterfall, a spring coming out of the ground. There's a kind of natural quality of such places which draws people to them. And then there are the experiences that happen there. And then in medieval Europe, there were all these cathedrals with relics of saints. So there was the idea that these parts of the bodies of holy men and women, or parts of the true cross on which Jesus was crucified. Of course, there were far more relics of the true cross than there could possibly have been in the actual cross. But nevertheless, these were the idea that physical objects could be imbued with a spiritual value. Was also, of course, a central doctrine in the interpretation of Holy Communion, the bread and the wine with a spiritual presence. Now, the Reformation was trying to get rid of all the pagan aspects of Catholicism, and many aspects of Catholicism were inherited from the pre-Christian past. The idea of holy places, of pilgrimages, of holy relics, and so on, together with the idea of sacred time through seasonal festivals. All of these were part of medieval Christianity, which were continuous with the pre-Christian past and with other religious traditions. All of them have sacred time, festivals, holy places, pilgrimages. So the Protestants attempt to purify Christianity of all these accretions that had grown up over time and go back to the Bible as the only source of authority, meant stripping away the entire history of cathedrals, of pilgrimages, and of course of development of Christian doctrine that had happened through the Church Fathers and through centuries of debate and reflection. It involved trying to strip it back to some more primitive state, which is beyond these accretions. And the effect was to disenchant the world. It involved suppressing pilgrimage, desecrating shrines, knocking down monasteries and convents. It involved stopping the monastic tradition in which many monks and nuns spent their time in prayer, contemplation and meditation in spiritual practices. So religion just simply became for lay people. There were no longer monks in the Protestant world or nuns. So all of these involved, in fact, getting rid of the sense of God in nature as much as possible and focusing on the relation between human minds and God, a kind of direct link to God, and the rest of nature became kind of marginalized. And this desecrated nature, disenchanted nature, preparing the way for the growth of mechanistic science in the 17th century. It was much easier for scientists to come along and say, well, there's no presence of God in nature. God may have made it in the first place, but it's all just mechanical and works automatically in accordance with mechanical principles and mathematical laws. So in a way, the Reformation prepared the way for the mechanistic disenchantment of nature, taking this whole process even further. And so I think that this had an enormous effect on European thought, more in Protestant countries than Catholic countries, although the influence also extended back into Catholic countries, and it provoked the Counter-Reformation, which made the Catholic Church less tolerant and more sectarian. So I think it had a not very good effect on the Catholic Church as well. But I think what we're seeing now is, a fading of a lot of this Protestant impulse and a rediscovery of these ways of connecting through spiritual practices, including pilgrimage and relating to nature, a rediscovery of some of these things that were lost or suppressed in the Protestant Reformation. But it was clearly an enormously important moment in the history of Europe. It's not so important for the rest of the world. I mean, it is important for the Americas because, and Australia and New Zealand, all those countries that were colonized by Europeans because they took this mindset with them. But, if you go to India, then the difference between Protestants and Catholics doesn't really bother most Hindus or Muslims in India, or Jains or Buddhists. I mean, this is a kind of sectarian squabble in Europe that's fairly irrelevant to their principal concerns, or Tibetan Buddhists. And, they've got their own history and their own dynamics.
Right, I think we have time for the last question, and I'm very glad to. Well, you know that already, that the translation of The Ways to Go Beyond is completed, and it'll come out in a few months. I'd like to ask you two questions, basically. I mean, that's like 3 or 4 years of effort to writing these two books, Science and Spiritual Practices and A Ways to Go Beyond. What was your primary, I mean, and of course, 3 or 4 years ago, you would have also alternative ways to spend your time and effort. Why did you take these? Why did you choose that? Why did you write these two books? And the last book has 7 practices as a previous one. And I'd like you to comment on, just please pick one of them and say something about that practice. So it's kind of 2-part question. Why did you write these 2 books? And ask you to comment on one practice from the last book.
Well, first, Hardy, let me say how grateful I am to you for actually translating these books and all the time and trouble it's taken you to do this.
It's a pleasure.
So they're available in Estonian, and I'm very pleased that they are. I think the reason I did it was because I think that we're in a kind of cultural and spiritual crisis in Europe, and that the decline of traditional religion, namely Christianity, means that large numbers of young people are growing up without any sense of our spiritual or religious traditions. Here in Britain, in a recent survey, more than 50% of the population said they had no religion. And most young people are growing up with no knowledge or connection with the Christian tradition. yet I think that there's a need for a connection beyond the merely mundane. And I mean, a materialist worldview gives a very limited view of human nature. It's all about things going on in our brains. It's about human needs and desires. And, and the materialist worldview encourages a purely material approach to consumption and living in general. And this leads to a very narrow view of human nature, and a very unsatisfying one. And I think it leads to a great spiritual hunger and sense of loss, which most people don't know how to deal with, because the educational system here in Britain is thoroughly secularized, and they won't get much from their schooling. They get a bit of comparative religion, which is basically formulated from a kind of secular humanist perspective. Buddhists believe this, Hindus believe that, Christians believe that, Jews believe that, rather like specimens in a museum of, foolish, superstitious beliefs that people used to think. But we now know nature is just made up of matter obeying the laws of physics and so forth. Well, that kind of attitude seems to me a perversion of science, a perversion of the scientific worldview, a false scientific worldview extended to the whole of society and the whole educational system, and to a spiritual hunger and deprivation, which also leads to a disconnection with the natural world, because the natural world is just material stuff without mind, soul, spirit, just resources for us to use. It has no purpose or meaning. Evolution's happened by chance. Our reactions to it are nothing but subjective experiences of what's happening through physical events in our brains. And this is a very limited, narrow, crippling worldview. And so it seemed to me that the very important to rediscover the value of spiritual practices. And since scientific studies of spiritual practices have now been going on for, well, some of them for 40 years or more, there's now a large body of evidence showing that these spiritual practices are beneficial, helpful to people, and potentially also helpful in relating to the earth and our environment in a more healthy way than the materialist worldview, which has led to the climate crisis and to the extinction of other species. Business as usual in a materialist worldview is fatal for us and highly damaging for the planet. So all of those are reasons why I thought it was very important to write these books, as an attempt to show how a range of spiritual practices are available to anyone, even if they don't have a religious practice, a religious faith, or religious tradition. And the fact that they've been scientifically studied, and that there's been a kind of scientific seal of approval or imprimatur on many of them, is relevant in this scientific age. So those are my reasons for doing it. And in terms of a specific practice, well, I won't talk about meditation because many people are already very familiar with meditation.
And that was from the first book anyway, but from the second book, if you could.
Yes, from the second book. Well, fasting, for example, is a practice which I discuss in the second book. And fasting is a practice found in all religious traditions. Jews fast at Yom Kippur, Hindus have many fast days, Muslims fast during the daylight hours in Ramadan, Christians fast during Lent, particularly during Holy Week. And fasting has also been studied scientifically and has been shown to have many health benefits. Now, it wouldn't be good for someone who's on very complex multiple medications or suffering from anorexia. So I'm not saying it's good for everyone, but for most people, a period of fasting. I myself do it 3 or 4 days or 5 days a year during Holy Week before Easter, just water and tea, no food. I think that the effects of fasting, detoxifying the body, reducing the fat cells which store many toxins, it releases growth hormone, it's psychoactive, it leads to more vivid dreams and greater clarity of mind. The ketone bodies in the blood when you fast, like beta hydroxybutyric acid, are closely related to neurotransmitters like gamma hydroxybutyric acid and gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA. So it's psychoactive. And I think it very beneficial in a purely bodily sense for health, but also in an emotional and spiritual sense. And it also helps us to be aware of how much we depend on food and take our food less for granted than we might have done. So I think there are many benefits. It's free. In fact, it actually saves money because you don't have to buy food. And if I ran the National Health Service here in Britain, I would encourage fasting to improve national health. And I train fasting counselors and roll out fasting programs and do research on fasting to find out, first of all, the kind of people it might be dangerous for, but also the kind of people it might be beneficial for, and encourage people to fast on a regular basis, which I think would have no great benefit on the national health and would be really helpful for a lot of people. And I think I'd also encourage Christians to take fasting in Lent and at other periods more seriously. Some take it quite seriously, but for others it's taken in a very almost jocular way. You know, people give up chocolate or ginger biscuits for Lent or something, when they could be doing something a bit more strenuous and more effective. Fasting is a practice that I think it has a spiritual dimension. It clearly has a physical and a mental and an emotional dimension. It's kind of integrated practice in that you don't have to have a belief system to fast, or at least you could fast as a materialist and it would still do you good. If you have a spiritual belief system and if you fast during one of the traditional fasting periods, it takes on other dimensions as well.
Right.